Imagine this. You're scrolling late at night, half distracted, half dissociating, when a quote catches your eye. Pride comes before the fall. You pause. It's one of those phrases you've heard 1,000 times. Almost cliché. But something about it sticks. Pride. The fall. It sounds ancient, like a warning passed down through centuries. And then you remember, there's a whole list, right? A famous one. Pride, envy, gluttony, and all the rest. But what if I told you that list, the 7 deadly sins, is older, stranger, and more psychologically revealing than we give it credit for? That it's not just about religious guilt or medieval doom, but a map of the human condition. That behind each sin is a story about desire, identity, fear, and the things we chase when we don't know who we are? This is not a sermon. This is not a lecture. This is an exploration. A deep, slow dive into the 7 deadly sins, not just where they came from, but why they still haunt us, and what they reveal about the darkest and most relatable parts of being human. So settle in. We're going all the way back to the desert monks of the 4th century, and we're going to follow the thread from ancient theology to modern psychology, from sacred texts to Instagram reels. Because these sins aren't just deadly, they're familiar. There's something ancient and magnetic about the idea of sin. Not just wrongdoing, but sin. The word itself feels heavy, spiritual, dramatic. It carries a kind of gothic weight that's hard to define but easy to feel. And at the heart of this concept lies one of the most enduring frameworks humanity has ever built around morality: the 7 deadly sins. Today, we're going on a journey not just through the list itself, but through its strange, spiritual, psychological, and cultural history. We're going to trace the sins from desert monks in the 4th century to modern-day TikTok trends, from theological doctrine to the inner architecture of the human mind. And we're going to ask a question. Why have these sins survived so long in our consciousness? And what do they really say about us? Let's begin at the very beginning, not with 7, but with 8. In the 4th century, a Christian monk named Evagrius Ponticus was living in the deserts of what is now Egypt. He was a mystic, a theologian, and an early practitioner of what we might now call spiritual psychology. In isolation, he began to catalog what he called logismoi evil thoughts. These were not just moral failings in action, but mental temptations that corrupted the soul from within. His list included gluttony, lust, avarice, anger, sadness, acedia, which we'll return to later, vainglory, and pride. Evagrius didn't see these as sins in the legalistic or behavioral sense. He saw them as afflictions of the soul distractions that pulled the monk away from divine focus. They were, in a sense, metaphysical diseases, and they weren't equal. Some were considered more destructive than others. For Evagrius, pride was the most dangerous because it turned the soul inward, away from God, and toward the illusion of self-sufficiency. Later, in the West, these ideas were translated and adapted by another monk, John Cassian, who brought them to Latin-speaking Christianity. But it was Pope Gregory I in the 6th century who truly rebranded and reshaped them into the form we recognize today. He collapsed sadness into sloth, combined vainglory and pride, and introduced envy into the mix. Suddenly, we had 7. A powerful number in biblical tradition. 7 days of creation, 7 sacraments, 7 seals, and now 7 deadly sins. Let's pause on that word, deadly. What makes a sin deadly? It's not that committing one of these sins guarantees damnation. Rather, in the traditional framework, each of these sins is a root, a foundational vice that leads to other moral and spiritual failures. In Latin, they were called capital vices. Capital from caput, meaning head. These were the head sins. The origin points. You didn't just steal because you were greedy. You stole because you were infected with avarice. You didn't just lash out in traffic, you burned with the sin of wrath. The sins weren't behaviors. They were states of the soul. Over time, these 7 categories became embedded in religious teaching, medieval art, and public imagination, and eventually, they escaped the confines of the church altogether. Before we unpack each sin, let's acknowledge something interesting. The list itself is not in the Bible. Nowhere in the Christian scriptures will you find a verse that says, "These are the 7 deadly sins." There are verses about sin, of course, lots of them, but this specific framework was a post-biblical construction. It was built by thinkers trying to make sense of spiritual disorder, and that's part of its brilliance. The 7 deadly sins aren't rules. They're diagnoses. They don't tell you what not to do. They tell you what's going wrong inside you. So let's meet the sins one by one and explore not only their theological meaning, but how they continue to manifest today. We begin with pride. Often considered the sin of all sins, pride is the belief that you are superior, self-sufficient, or above others, even above God. In Christian doctrine, it's pride that led Lucifer to fall. It's pride that drove Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. But pride isn't just religious. In the modern world, it's often disguised as self-confidence, ambition, or personal branding. We're told to believe in ourselves, to hustle, to stand out. But at what point does self-love become self-idolatry? Social media thrives on a subtle form of pride, the curated self. The influencer who turns their life into a spectacle. The motivational speaker who claims to have all the answers. The CEO who thinks rules don't apply to them. Pride isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, seductive, and dressed as success. Next is greed or avarice, the insatiable desire for more. More money, more stuff, more status. Greed is never satisfied. It's not about having, it's about wanting. In the Middle Ages, greed was depicted as a man devouring coins or hoarding gold. Today, we might picture luxury hauls, lifestyle vloggers, or Wall Street corruption. But greed isn't always about money. It can be about power, influence, even emotional validation. In a capitalist world, where consumption is encouraged and scarcity is feared, greed often wears the mask of aspiration. It tells us we don't have enough, not because we actually don't, but because we could have more. Then there's wrath, uncontrolled anger, often paired with a thirst for vengeance. Wrath isn't just rage. It's rage that burns, rage that consumes. In religious art, wrath was often painted as fire. But today, wrath has gone digital. It lives in comment sections, viral takedowns, and cancel culture. There's a righteousness to modern wrath, a sense that anger is justified, especially when aimed at injustice. But even righteous anger can curdle into self-righteousness. Wrath, unchecked, stops listening. It shouts. It cancels. It devours. Envy is perhaps the quietest of the sins and the most poisonous. It is not the desire to have something, but the hatred of others for having it. Envy corrodes the soul because it turns admiration into resentment. In the age of Instagram, envy is ambient. It's in the way we scroll through other people's vacations, weddings, careers. It's the subtle ache of comparison. Why not me? Envy thrives on illusion, on the belief that someone else's life is better, easier, or more deserved. It makes gratitude impossible. And worse, it makes joy yours or others feel like a personal attack. Lust, by contrast, is often misunderstood. In its original form, lust wasn't just about sex. It was about being consumed by desire. It was the loss of rationality, the surrender of self-control. In a world saturated with explicit content, it's easy to see how lust functions today. But lust can also be psychological. It's not always about the act, it's about the fixation, the objectification, the replacement of connection with craving. In religious terms, lust wasn't sinful because it was sexual. It was sinful because it replaced sacred union with selfish hunger. Gluttony, similarly, is not just about food. It's about excess. It's about overindulgence in anything eating, not because you're hungry, but because you're bored or numb. Drinking not to celebrate, but to escape. Watching 5 hours of content because you can't stand silence. Gluttony is a refusal of discipline. And in a society of abundance, gluttony is easy. It doesn't feel dangerous, but it can hollow us out from the inside. And finally, sloth. This sin has evolved the most in meaning. Originally, sloth was not just laziness. It was acedia, a spiritual apathy, a refusal to care, a kind of soul-deep indifference. Acedia was the monk staring at the wall, unable to pray, feeling nothing. Today, we might call it burnout, depression, dissociation. Sloth in the modern world often looks like scrolling for hours, not because you're entertained, but because you don't want to face anything else. It's not that you're lazy, it's that you're numb. And that's what makes it deadly. When you step back, the 7 deadly sins aren't just a moral checklist. They're a mirror. Each one reflects a distortion of something good. Pride twists dignity. Greed twists ambition. Wrath twists justice. Envy twists admiration. Lust twists love. Gluttony twists enjoyment. And sloth twists rest. These aren't alien urges. They're human. Deeply human. And that's why they've lasted so long. Not because they're written in stone, but because they're written in us. In the end, the 7 deadly sins are not just warnings. They are invitations to examine our motives, our patterns, our addictions. To ask not, am I breaking the rules? But what is ruling me? They invite us into self-awareness, into accountability, and perhaps into something that looks a little like redemption. So, what do we do with all of this? The 7 deadly sins aren't commandments. They're not rules to follow or break. They're more like signals, internal alarms. They flare up when something in us is off balance, when confidence becomes arrogance, when hunger becomes addiction, when ambition forgets empathy. And we've all felt them, every one of us. Not because we're bad, but because we're alive. Maybe that's the real reason the sins still matter. Not because they point to eternal damnation, but because they point to something real, something human. They don't demand perfection. They just ask us to notice, to stay awake, to look inward. And maybe that's enough. Thanks for listening. If this resonated with you, share it, reflect on it, or just sit with it for a while. The sins aren't going anywhere, but neither is your ability to face them. I'll see you in the next one.